We're so looking forward to his presentation regarding the book, his latest book. We're celebrating this book launch of Meltdown Expected, Crisis, Disorder, and Upheaval at the End of the 1970s. Please welcome Aaron J. Leonard.
Oh, well, thank you, Patricia and Stephanie, for the wonderful introduction and for hosting this. I'm going to go ahead and share. I'm going to run through a PowerPoint that gives an overview of the book. So if you just bear with for a second. And all right. So Meltdown Expected, Crisis, Disorder, and Upheaval at the End of the 1970s. Rutgers, the art department, or the artists at Rutgers, I just played for them London Calling by The Clash and excerpted a quote from Mick Jones, who said the song was about everything falling apart at the end of the 70s. And they noodled, and this is what they came up with, which I think is absolutely brilliant. What I want to do here is, we have a limited amount of time. I want to give an overview of the book, which is presented in thematic chapters rather than chronologically. But my main contention is that the period approximately from November 78 to the end of December 1979 constituted the end of the me decade and the beginning of the final phase of the Cold War. Specifically, in thinking back of the decade of the 70s, it occurred to me that you could actually break that decade into three parts. The end of the 60s, a 70s interlude, and the end of the 70s. So like for the first 2 years of the 70s decade, it's really still the 60s. This headline here is January 1973, where an accord is reached to end the Vietnam War. I mean, they'd already been drawing down troops and limiting the amount of people were subject to the draft, by using more and more bombs. But that particular issue kind of hit its milestone at the very beginning of January 73. But in advance of that, you had the Kent State killings. You had the largest demonstration in Washington, D.C. on May Day in 1971, including Vietnam veterans throwing their medals on the steps of the White House. Barry Romo, a leader of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, just passed away. He was one of the organizers of that action. And you had the uprising of prisoners at Attica State, which was not just a prison riot, but actually had a whole political character. So, for the first 2 years of the 70s decade, it really is still the 60s. But then you get into this interim or this interlude. Tom Wolfe names it the me decade. Tom Wolfe, somebody who is, he's got a reputation for being snarky. He pretty much, any particular popular era, he has something smart to say about it. So he wrote this article in New York Magazine, and it stuck. Rather than this kind of self-sacrifice and more communal spirit of the 60s, we get the me decade. You have a lot of disco. You've got Debbie Boone, You Light Up My Life, Saturday Night Fever, and you've got Jimmy Carter, who is replacing Nixon and trying to, repair the whole wreckage that the Nixon administration had wrought. Here he is talking to Congress in 78, the very beginning of 78, and here's how he characterizes the world.
Again found our moral course, and with a new spirit, we are striving to express our best instincts to the rest of the world. There is all across our land a growing sense of peace and a sense of common purpose. This sense of unity.
Yeah, so he's painting a pretty rosy picture. He comes in and he is advocating for human rights. You know, the US's reputation off of Vietnam has really taken a massive hit. Carter, you know, he has the Allman Brothers behind him, and he's the young, cool president who's going to turn the country around. You know, as we'll see, you know, over the course of the next couple of years, things don't go so well. But you have this period approximately between 73 and 78, so 5+ years, where it's the 70s. You know, Happy Days is on. You know, Happy Days is part of the nostalgia that's been promoted from, you know, actually Rock Around the Clock. There were riots in the 50s. This is something I talked about in my previous book. When Bill Haley and the Comets song came out, it was a catalyst for youthful rebellion. In the 70s, it's put in front of this piece of pop culture confection called Happy Days, where you have this hoodlum Fonzie, who's a lovable guy in a black leather jacket. So, you know, things have chilled out in the 70s, while the U.S. essentially tries to come to grips with all the turmoil from the previous decade. But then November 78 comes, and things are starting to change. I mean, it's like any phenomenon, there's old and new aspects mixed in, but a number of things happen somewhat simultaneously. The situation in Iran is growing increasingly tumultuous. These are demonstrators in the United States. Iranian students, you know, the Shah of Iran had, you know, sent a fair amount of students to the U.S. to become experts. The Shah is not beloved at this point. He's facing increasingly secular and Islamic opposition, and it's starting to reach a fever pitch in November 78. He'll be toppled within a few months. The Clash, who are, you know, start out as a punk band, you know, amid a mix of Sex Pistols and Ramones, who had emerged 76, 77. The Clash are starting to get their footing. They're somebody I focus on because they seem to have a better grasp of the time, more, I guess, consciously or more intellectually. And I'm not disparaging the other bands. The punk energy, I think, it's a kind of a manifesto in itself. But the Clash here, you know, what's interesting is that's a Red Army soldier, you know, approaching a carcass in the desert. Famously, Mick Jones wore Chinese Red Guard armband in opposition to Susie Sue, for one, wore a swastika armband, and some of the punks had, you know, adopted some of this fascist imagery, mainly to shock, not because they were fascists. But so the Clash were going to be left punks. Harvey Milk is brutally murdered along with George Moscone in San Francisco, the first gay elected representative. He's murdered by a conservative member of supervisor, they're called in San Francisco, not council member. And it causes a lot of upset among especially the gay community, which is starting to become a lot more militant and a lot less inclined toward, you know, going back into the closet. I mean, this is, you know, the further developments of things since Stonewall. And then in China, there's a major change underway. Democracy Wall, where people are allowed to put up their thinking on various issues. I mean, it's ostensibly, well, you know, China might be moving toward democracy now that Mao is dead, but it's really, as I get into in the book, it's part of a mechanism to take Mao down a few pegs and allow China to more adopt a market economy, what they would call socialism, with Chinese characteristics. And then you've got Jim Jones, who, you know, leads a mass murder homicide in Jonestown. What I didn't realize on Jones is Jeff Gwynn's written an excellent book about Jim Jones and Jonestown, is Jones considers himself a socialist, and he's trying to build a utopia in Guyana. I just want to play a little clip of this song, which I just blew me away.
Arise, ye graces of salvation.
There's much more I could say about Jim Jones, but at the point where he kills everybody, he had been visited by a U.S. congressman on a fact-finding mission, but also Charles Gary, Huey P. Newton's attorney, had been hired by Jones as his attorney. So Jones is kind of straddling that tension at the end of 70s of kind of holding on to some of that radicalism, but it's spiraling off in very extreme directions, you know, in Jones's case, tragic and horrific directions. So that's kind of the three phases. So the 78, the Cold War had reached a certain point where the détente was kind of going on. And I get into it in the book, and I'm not going to get into a big exposition of it here, but the U.S. for a moment, you know, is no longer confronting China and the Soviet Union. China is reconciling with the U.S., so the U.S. only has to worry about the Soviet Union, and it allows them some flexibility to repair the damage of the 60s. But, you know, this big problem drops into the whole equation, which is that the Shah gets overthrown. This is the times in 77. Iranian students demonstrating, the police unleash tear gas, the wind blows the wrong way. Jimmy Carter and Rosalind are both, you know, hit with tear gas. So it's a pretty embarrassing moment. And I have this quote here from Donald Wilbur, who's doing an after report about the coup that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, who had ruled Iran. He was kind of a liberal Democrat in Iran, and the CIA overthrew him because they were worried he was getting a little too close to the Soviet Union and jumping ship into the jumping the U.S. Bloc ship, as it were. So after Mossadegh is overthrown, the CIA is writing about the concern of blowback from, you know, doing these kind of things, these coups, and it's a pretentious statement because, in fact, the blowback from Iran is something we're still dealing with now. So the Shah is overthrown, and it's a year of turmoil where Ayatollah Khomeini comes back from France. The Islamic forces actually have a lot of power, and I think it's largely underestimated by a lot of people. I mean, there's a lot of secular forces. I mean, here they're burning an effigy of the CIA and Down with Carter and imperialism. So this definitely has the stamp of leftism. These leftists are soon going to find themselves on the wrong side of the Islamic Republic. But for the year 79, it's a mighty back and forth. Meanwhile, the U.S. is writing memos back and forth, concerned about the Soviets taking advantage of what's going on in Iran. So it's emblematic of the global conflict between the U.S. and Soviets, which has ratcheted up, you know, quite a degree. You know, at the same time, you've got this unexpected event. So there's a whole energy crisis in the 70s, you know, stemming from the 1973 war between Israel and Egypt, where the U.S. aided Israel, and OPEC basically reduced the amount of oil coming into the U.S., cut it off at a certain point. Gas prices are through the roof. You know, the economy is really reeling, you know, trying to pay the bills from Vietnam. Nuclear energy is something that's promoted, and it is far more unpredictable than the people running it understand. There is a leak in in Middletown, Pennsylvania, near Harrisburg, the capital, that, you know, it's a partial meltdown, and it threatens to get to be a very big catastrophe. It's contained, but what's actually expressed in that event is that there are things wholly out of control of the authorities and the engineers and the expertise, and it scares a lot of people, rightly so, but it's tied up with the fact that at the same time that 3 Mile Island is having its problem, the U.S. is redoubling its war plans for nuclear war. I write about this in this chapter. I get into it in more detail, but suffice it to say, it's not just 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island actually expresses something deeper. So there's a concert of artists, the musicians for safe energy, the Muse concerts, and it's an attempt to kind of pick up that kind of 60s spirit, which I say is it's still there, but it's fraying. So the concert comes off. It's successful, but I think some of the best people to perform are Bruce Springsteen, Gil Scott-Heron, and Peter Tosh. Some of the folks who were icons in the 60s are, they're starting to feel a little worn. I mean, not to disparage them totally, but the Muse concert isn't quite what everybody hoped it would be. And then, within days of 3 Mile Island, there was a leak of anthrax in Sverdlovsk in Russia, the Soviet Union. A number of people die of the anthrax infection. The Soviets are not supposed to be producing it, but given the state of the economy, it's more cost effective to weaponize anthrax than it is to, redouble their military budget, something that'll come to haunt them, when Reagan comes into power. So there's a number of these out of control crises that happen that, basically pose existential questions to the population. Coupled with this, 1979 is the year that the most people are employed in industry in the United States, in manufacturing. It's a statistic that belies the fact that per capita industry has already been fleeing the US. And in 79, you can see it's happening at a much greater pace. US Steel drops 13,000 jobs. It devastates pieces of Ohio into Chicago. The cities like Philadelphia and New York are seeing industries flee by 10, 15, 20%. And this is part of what's undergirding the financial crisis. Automation is starting to take hold, undoing jobs, something we're seeing today with artificial intelligence. And you've got Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, saying that the standard of living of the average American has to decline. A rather bald statement that kind of goes to the core of the social contract between the U.S. working class in particular and the ruling political structure. This is obviously not something that gets corrected. It's, in the course of writing this book, I'm just struck by how important deindustrialization is and how it's not the centerpiece of the conversation in the way it ought to be, because I think the impact is still very telling. China today is considered the workshop of the world and not the US. And then I talk about, the ideology that reinforces this concept of neoliberalism, which Thatcher and Reagan articulate, which is, people should be responsible for themselves. The government shouldn't take care of them. I mean, it's a very handy ideology when you basically don't have the economic base you used to have. I think neoliberalism is it's an artful argument for a fundamental economic shift. And then China is transforming in a major way. Mao, for 10 years, had led a cultural revolution. He said socialism ought to be a certain kind of thing where it's the masses of people who are in control, and the way we're going to keep the masses of people in control is through ideology. They have this slogan, politics in command, that if you grasp revolution, promote production is one of the slogans. So if you can just be more communist, you can keep a communist society. 10 years of cultural revolution is very disruptive. The former leadership has largely been cast out. But by 76, that experiment is failing, basically. And the old leadership is being brought in, and there's a lot of back and forth, and it's much more complicated than I can summarize in 1 or 2 slides, as much as I would like to. But Mao dies. His closest left-wing followers are arrested. An interim leader is appointed, Hua Guofeng. Hua Guofeng is followed by Deng Xiaoping, who takes China in a direction far to the right of what Mao ever conceived. And it's really laying the basis for China being this major power that it is today. So this is 1979. This is, you can draw a line between that and today. I mean, Peking Review, implementing the socialist principle to each according to his work. I mean, it sounds like a kind of a benign headline, but it's reference to Karl Marx, who defined socialism as essentially, well, under socialism, you get paid for the amount of work you do, whereas communism, you get paid for what you need. So the Chinese are not talking about communism here. They're talking about, a socialism that's basically going to feed people, but not try to get into this lofty utopian vision. And as I mentioned earlier, the posters that are put up near Tiananmen Square are there to essentially open the door to criticizing Mao, who's been almost a religious icon. The cult of personality around him precluded any criticism. So certain level of criticism is allowed to bring Mao down. Deng Xiaoping famously says, "We are not going to do to Mao what Khrushchev did to Stalin." Khrushchev got up and just savaged Stalin. And it was extremely disruptive for the Soviet Union, and it was devastating for communist parties. And this is not to argue for the good and bad of Stalin, but it's more like if you take on your preeminent leader, you risk delegitimating the whole thing. Deng Xiaoping is smarter than Khrushchev. He's like, we're not going to do that to Mao. We're going to revere him for the role he played in winning the revolution and guiding us, in the initial time, but, we're also going to criticize him. And then, I take a little bit of a sidetrack here, and, I indulge myself a little bit because I came out of a certain radical milieu in the mid-70s, and I was a supporter of this group, the Revolutionary Communist Party. So it was, a focus of my attention about what the ultra-left was doing in that time. And in writing this book, I came to assess that among certain forces of the ultra-left, there was a whole complement of people who kind of went more toward reformism, working with the left wing of the Democratic Party. And I also make the point that I think, the greater number of people in the 60s came out of that trying to hold on to some kind of social justice sensibility. And this was in contrast to the media, who tried to portray all the ex-radicals as essentially, selling out. People like Eldridge Cleaver, who came back and wanted to sell crotchless garments for men so they wouldn't be like sissies, or, Huey P. Newton, who just spiraled down and down, throughout the later years of his life, toward a tragic end on the streets of Oakland, trying to buy crack cocaine. But I think millions of people came out of the 60s wanting a better world and wanting to dedicate a certain amount of their energies towards social justice. But there was a section who stayed pretty left. So I do a chapter on them. And the three exemplars of this are the RCP, which they have a demonstration when Deng comes to Washington, and they end up in a street battle with police that's short and bloody. They're charged with felonies. It's like the first time they end up in this kind of trouble since they came into being. And it conditions themselves going forward. I mean, this group is still around. Its leader, Bob Avakian, who was arrested at this demonstration. I mean, he went to Europe after this because he was worried about, being imprisoned, and he really hasn't surfaced as a fully public figure since. So 79 is a pivotal moment for them. Even more tragically is the Communist Workers' Party, who they're extremely ultra-left. They do a throwdown to the Klan. They're based in a textile mill in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they tell the Klan, you cowards, we dare you to come and confront us when we have our Death to the Klan march, or we dare you to come and show up when we have our Death to the Klan march. Unfortunately, they do come, and they come with an arsenal, and they kill members, 4 members of the Communist Workers' Party, pretty much in cold blood. The CWP has a few handguns. The Nazis and Klans have trunk full of weapons, and the police basically stand aside, kind of like this recent UCLA incident, although a lot more volatile. The police basically stand aside for a half hour while the two sides square off. And it's striking to me that after this happens, there's a demonstration for the funeral, but only 500 people show up. The next day, the Iranians take over the embassy in Iran, so this is no longer news. And then I talk about the MOVE organization in 1978, who have a confrontation with the police. It ends up one of the police is killed, probably by friendly fire, but it's still disputed. And the police on camera beat one of the MOVE members pretty badly. Two or three police beat Delbert Africa pretty badly. The continuity between the three is this quote from Avakian: "It's going to be a battle, a struggle, a leap. We can, we must, and we will." This sense of end of days, this millenarian view of where things are at. And they're not really there. I mean, things are getting extreme for sure, and they're going to be very challenging, but it is not the end of the world. But the radicalism that emerged all these folks is still kind of at their core, and they're having difficulty reconciling that. And another group is the Weathermen, who become Prairie Fire organization, and also on the East Coast, they become the May 19th Communist Movement. These people are, there's a qualitative difference between these folks and the folks I just described, because at the center of their doctrine is political violence. And largely they've been operating, underground. And they become, the unwinding of them between 78 and 79 is striking. This guy on the left here is Clayton Lithograph. He's a Communist Party veteran. Him and 3 of his comrades are arrested in Texas. The state says, they were planning a series of terrorist acts. They are put on trial. This red publication is something that was produced at the time, which I write about in the book. That it just seems like it's a hodgepodge of demands, and it's straining to be political and relevant in a situation in which you're underground and you really can't be out there openly. But the sentencing of these Prairie Fire members in Texas, the judge, I just thought this was a withering statement. It's a tragedy that 5 effective, intelligent persons should be involved in such a waste of time, which they could have devoted to some higher purpose. I mean, that's a conversation point for sure, but I thought it was just different than the, oh my God, terrorism, and we need to do this and that. It was much more like, what have you guys accomplished? And then, of course, on the bottom right is Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, who had been the most fiery representatives of the Weather Underground. They turned themselves in around this time. So different people are finding different ways to reincorporate into the reality of the late 70s. Also, so that's let's call it the white left, if you will. The white left inclined to political violence. On the other end, offshoots of the Black Panther Party have become the Black Liberation Army. They've done some, political violence-oriented actions. It's the full book on this group has not been written, mainly out of necessity, because they were operating in a covert way and they were breaking major laws. So they, any attempt to be candid. I read Assata Shakur's autobiography, which I know a lot of people on the left love, but I read it and I was very frustrated that one gets no sense of what I consider probably the most important part of her life, which is when she is said to be head of the Black Liberation Army. regardless, she in the early 70s, her and some comrades are set upon by New Jersey State Police. There's a shootout. One of the folks dies. One of the folks is captured. Joanne Chesimar is her born name, but Asada Shakur is wounded. She's sent to prison for life, and they break her out circa 78, 79, and she makes her way to Cuba, and so she's still there. But at the trial of some of her comrades later on, you get this quote from Tyrone Reason: "We felt that just robbing Brinks trucks or guards or banks wasn't totally what we were about. It was time to do something that was totally political." So one gets a sense of a certain desperation to remain relevant in changing times. I mean, I've come to, the 60s sensibility on political violence is there was kind of a culture of supporting it. I've become much more, I've taken a different critical look at it. I mean, one of the things I assess is that coming out of this is the power structure was able to sharpen some of its implements of repression. Somebody from the Brookings Institute, because hardcore terrorists are relatively isolated, they can be dealt with primarily as a police problem. I have this article, if you're curious and you haven't read the book, Jacobin. You can just Google Jacobin, Aaron J. Leonard, Fred Hampton, and I talk about Fred Hampton's killed in December 69 with the help of this guy, William O'Neill, and his agent, FBI handler, Roy Martin Mitchell. But O'Neill and Mitchell in 73 also do a case against a corrupt Chicago cop named Stanley Robinson. So rather than recounting the whole thing here, I talk about O'Neill and Mitchell into the late 70s, because what comes out of this whole thing is a bunch of court cases which essentially uphold an informant being on the scene when somebody is murdered, because Mitchell actually goes with Stanley Robinson and they kill somebody, Jeff Beard, a young guy. And Beard is targeted because Stanley Robinson is getting paid to kill people while he's a Chicago police detective. The FBI is running a case against him. This goes to the court because Jeff Beard's sister says, the FBI should have stopped this. And the court says, no, they shouldn't have, because they were just doing their thing, running informants. So it's part of how the accountability of the church committee and such has ended, really starkly with these two characters. Mark Felt, who goes on to become Deep Throat, and Edward S. Miller. He doesn't go on to become, he is Deep Throat a few years earlier. They're put on trial for breaking in to various places of the Weathermen, some Palestinian support groups, the U.S.-China Friendship Group, the Revolutionary Communist Label Bergman. They're put on trial. They're found guilty. They're given a $5,000 fine. And then when Reagan comes into office, he totally pardons them, saying, look, we were in a period of warfare, in the early 70s when they were doing this. And these guys, basically they're heroes. My words, not his, but, they shouldn't be charged. So this is part of, the accountability that started, pre-Carter and into Carter is evaporating. It's turning to ether. So I'm going to kind of move quickly here because I want to make sure Patricia has time to ask her questions. I have a chapter on the cultural milieu, and I traverse the terrain from the anti-disco demolition thing that turns it to a riot at Wrigley Field, to the Who concert, which tragically a bunch of young kids die because, concert tickets are general admission. Rock Against Racism is exploding in England. The Clash is at the forefront with their album London Calling, which is really a good document of the year 1979. It talks about, not only 3 Mile Island, but things like the lately one or two have fully paid their due for working for the clampdown, which is a reference to the Shah and Anastasia Somoza. And then Bob Dylan, he goes in another direction. He retreats into Christianity. So anybody waiting for Bob to show the way is going to be greatly disappointed. Also here, you've got the right assuming more and more power. They're getting on television. They're having publications, and they're starting to get into office. Phyllis Schlafly and Jerry Falwell. And, obviously today they're a major political force. The new Pope, who's very anti-communist, comes in with a major statement against moral anarchy, standing on the other side of gay rights, gay liberation, and the whole notion of gender acceptance, if you will. And then culturally, you have a few movies that are attempting to speak to the Vietnam War in different ways. And I take a critical eye to all of them, which I'll not share with you here. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Harvey Milk is not convicted of the highest charge for killing. Dan White is not given the highest charge for killing Dan White and George Monscone. And that leads to this. So, the gay community is not going back. There's large mass demonstrations, but I think the response to the trial of Dan White is symbolic of things that turn the page. Meanwhile, internationally, the contention between the U.S. is getting very sharp. China is now an ally of the U.S. Vietnam is a much firmer ally of the Soviet Union. The Vietnamese invade Cambodia. The Chinese invade Vietnam. It's very disorienting for people who had come through the anti-war movement and, had a kind of a rather clear, simplistic view of Vietnam's the good guys, America's the bad guys. Suddenly, that's all complicated. Enough said for that for now. Somoza has to leave Nicaragua. He ends up being executed the following year, and that gives rise to the Sandinista government, which will be, very contentious through the Reagan years. Maurice Bishop comes to power in tiny Grenada, and as you can see, he's standing next to Fidel Castro, which is a big problem for the United States. So, the whole global order is starting to come up for grabs in a way that it has not been in the recent past. This is a big news, Brzezinski. I encourage the Chinese to support Pol Pot because, the U.S. couldn't. So this is one of the things where, it's just cold-blooded, real politics, and it has real implications. But this is the Jimmy Carter regime. Brzezinski is not freelancing. He's doing this with the full support. I know Jimmy Carter is getting ready to die, and I know when he dies, there'll be all these plaudits. But the fact of the matter is, Carter and Brzezinski started funding the mujahideen in Afghanistan before the Soviet invasion. And that comes out in the book. So, the CIA actually reprinted the Quran in Uzbek to circulate it in Afghanistan. So, this whole rise of Islamism was not just a spontaneous thing. It was supported. And I'm not saying they're responsible for it, but it was like the U.S. Basically, did create certain problems. And then the whole process, this book, The Coming World War, August 85, is a bestseller in the New York Times. It's an argument for NATO. But the fact that this book is being written and it's a popular read indicates where things have come to. And I want to show, if you remember, Carter at the beginning was talking about there is all our land a sense of peace. Um, here's what he's saying a year later, a little more than a year later.
Put my campaign promises into law about a fundamental threat to American democracy. I do not mean our political and civil liberties. They will endure. And I do not refer to the outward strength of America, a nation that is at peace tonight everywhere in the world, with unmatched economic power and military might. The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
So that's the famous Malaise speech, which he caught a lot of crap for. Basically saying the quiet part out loud, that the U.S. was riven by divisions and facing international challenges. It was supposed to be a talk on energy, but it ended up being something else. I don't know. Well, he was dealing with a revolution in Iran and all these other things I just spoke to. So Jimmy Carter is, going into the 1980 election, a totally transformed political entity of sorts. So this kind of brings us to the end. Iran is consolidated around the Islamic Republic. The Soviets have rolled into Afghanistan. That's going to be a major fault line. And this article, The Age of Depletion, looking backward on a decade that may yet prove better than those to come, which I thought was a very provocative headline. So that ends my presentation. So I've got 3 books. So, and chronologically, they kind of one follows the other, because I did want to kind of pick up where I left off, but not exactly in the same way. There's a little FBI stuff in here around the Hampton and the Iranian students, but not quite as much. But any one of these 3 books, if you're curious about, what I've been focused on, these are a good thing. So I'm going to stop sharing. And Pat, are you there? I think we're ready for questions.
I am here, and so I'm looking forward to hearing more from you. And thank you so much for that presentation. Aaron, let me start with a kind of a process question. What made you decide to go thematic as opposed to chronological?
It was kind of, I started writing it chronologically, and I was like, oh, you're just trying to get a book written, as opposed to, what I write in the introduction is so I wanted to write something a little bit different. I wanted to write something about history, contemporary history. I mean, the old mantra, write what you know. And I did reflect on the fact that the period 78, 79, I was 19. I saw all these things happening. They were very intense. When you're 18 and 19, you absolutely understand everything. And I did. But now I'm 67 and I understand them all quite differently. So, and I figured the best way to do this was to unpack these topics as a theme. I mean, to talk about the restoration of a kind of a market economy in China, it's not enough to just weave it into a chronological narrative. It's like, let's talk about it in its own right. So, I think it works. I think it's a better way to tell this story than just, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened. So,
well, of course, I was reminded of my back pages. I was so much older then. I'm younger than that now.
Yeah, I hear you. And look, I'm a little defensive because I would hate to think I'm that old, in the sense of not feeling like humanity or the human project has a future. I don't want to be that person. I am a lot more dubious about things that seemed like pretty complete answers.
Well, it's an interesting time to try to recover the 1970s. And as someone who came of age during them, I remember our previous conversation. My father, who was an arch conservative, was railing against Carter for giving away, air quotes, virtual audience members, giving away the Panama Canal. And so I read your book with two minds, thinking of myself as the young person trying to understand, and then thinking of my father, who was a veteran of the Korean War. So I wonder, and I'm trying to frame this in terms of your preface, which I love, and anybody who is reading Meltdown Expected may see that I have a key page marked here, and I read this to Aaron before we got started. Let me, if I may, Aaron, just read that one sentence, if you don't mind. This is from the preface, Aaron writing about himself. Being there was not the same as understanding where I was. Historians love that perspective. Let me ask you about tackling this subject. What were the challenges for you? What can you think of a particular challenge you had in trying to have that tension between the objectivity of the historical record and then being there as well?
It's a good question. I had a friend read this who was contemporary of me at the time, and they read through an early draft and they said, "Oh, it just sounds like you're trying to work out a lot of stuff. And you focus a lot on this and you focus a lot on that." It was actually helpful because I did kind of go back through it and tried to be a lot more disinterested and a lot more objective versus just, well, here's what I remember, and so here's what it was important and things like that. So, but that was a challenge, was stepping outside of myself. Also, I had this argument. The last 2 years of the 70s are actually the beginning of the end of the Cold War, or beginning of the final phase of the Cold War. Well, is that true? And, the way it goes is, if you're right, the facts just keep coming at you. And if you're wrong, you just, oh, I need to find something to show this. I need to find, well, the facts just came at me. I mean, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association, is created after 3 Mile Island in 1979, but along with dealing with nuclear disasters, it's dealing with how to deal with civilian populations after a nuclear attack. The MX missile, the most powerful nuclear missile, which I think it kind of spreads out and sends multiple missiles at once. This is done under Carter. So, the whole notion that the U.S. is basically going to the Soviet Union and saying, we have a much bigger military infrastructure than you. You go ahead and make you an anthrax. Well, there's a famous quote. William Safire, who was the speechwriter for Richard Nixon. Nixon famously ended the U.S. production of biological weapons. And Safire says, shouldn't you keep a few of them around just in case? And Nixon says, oh, we don't need that crap. If they use bioweapons, we'll nuke them. Which, thanks, Nixon. We have a clear statement from you. But it shows you just shows you the severity or the risk involved. I mean, obviously, it's Nixon predates, the period I'm writing about. But that doctrine is the same. The U.S. is not producing nuclear or biological weapons largely in the 70s. They're producing nuclear weapons, including the neutron bomb, which is supposed to be oh, well, it's not going to destroy building. It's only going to kill people. I think today we would call that a dirty bomb, but the U.S. government was producing that. So
Another question that I think the audience is interested in is that you're really doing a reevaluation of Carter. And I think the almost hagiography of Carter is important to the Democratic Party. But a more, I'll use this term, sober assessment of Carter has been sorely lacking. How do you look at Carter now, even though we're being primed to mourn the man and the passing of someone who's considered a tremendous humanitarian and an upstanding Christian, and also a deeply misunderstood antecedent to the Reagan era?
well, I think he is a deeply misunderstood, but for probably largely the wrong. Look, when Jimmy Carter today, I think he's lived a good life. I think the good things people say about the life he lived after he became president, as near as I know, they're all valid. It seems like he's tried to do good in the world, but from a historical standpoint, the most important thing about Jimmy Carter are those years, 1976 to 1980, when he occupied the most powerful position in the world. I don't think we do ourselves any favor for not looking at for exactly what it was. He took the U.S. from the post-Vietnam disorder, into the pre-end of the Cold War period. I mean, had he been reelected and not Reagan, I mean, it's possible he probably wouldn't have sold arms for hostages like Reagan did. He might not have funded the Contras, but he certainly was going right up in the Soviet Union's face and saying, this stops here. You're not going from Afghanistan into Iran. The Middle East is ours. I mean, he had the geopolitical interests of the United States, at heart. And what I said about, the funding of the mujahideen, I mean, that really is Carter. So, we can talk about him personally. And, I think I would have good things to say about him personally. But the problem is he was president. I have this kind of phrase, in order to be president, you've got to be willing to commit crimes against humanity. And that's I can't think of, I mean, it's more happening. I mean, from Harry Truman to Roosevelt. I mean, he interred whatever. I don't have to do a whole exposition, but if you're going to be part of leading the most powerful empire in the world, which is, held by its military power, you've got to be willing to do very questionable things. I mean, everybody gets to sleep at night telling themselves their own stories, but so yeah, Jimmy Carter, I think, the years he was president, I think we should look at him differently. And I don't think we should, except not because, oh, yay, we get to dump on Carter, but it's like, what does that tell us about today? And what does that tell us about where we might get and how we should behave? I mean, being an old communist, I had to confront the fact that Stalin was a bad guy. I don't want to live in a world where 500,000 people can be executed because somebody's wrong. These are crimes against people, and it shouldn't happen. And if you want a world that's not like that, you've got to be willing to do things differently.
We're at the top of the hour, but I do want to, with your indulgence, Aaron, and with the audience, who of course can come back and watch this later, if you have a little bit more time, we do have another question, if that's okay.
Of course.
Okay. This question is from Henry. What is your assessment of some people from the left movement of the 1970s putting forward the position that China is now a socialist country and is in line with the Mao legacy?
Well, I think the evidence speaks for itself. China itself says we are a socialist country with Chinese characteristics. I mean, they're engaged in commodity production. I mean, the manufacture in China is based on producing goods to be sold for a profit. The profit actually comes from, the old Marxist term of extracting surplus labor value from people's work. I think everything about China points to it, operating on a continual growth. Things have to expand. Every element of the economy, tethers back to a market-based economy in a global setting. I mean, under Mao, the idea was to become self-sufficient, and they had to abandon it. I think Morris Meisner, the late historians, pointed out China has a problem growing enough food for its people just because of the amount of land that can be cultivated. China has to be part of the world. And I think after the Vietnam War and after Mao died, it did become more connected into the world. And I'm not arguing that Mao could have, continued other than what he did, but so that's a long answer, maybe a little bit a roundabout, because I think it's a very important and difficult question. But I just don't see it being socialist if you are basically producing things to sell for profit and constantly expanding your economy, and that, secondarily, let's take care of our people. I mean, under the previous regime, there was a lot more emphasis about the needs of people, and this concept of to get rich is glorious was something that was frowned upon. But, in other words, I think to use a Jell-O reference, the proof is in the pudding.
Something that your book reminds me of as well is a reconsideration of the daily lives of people in the United States at the end of the Vietnam War, but also going through the oil crises, because there was more than one, and the economic downturn that happens. And there's a book entitled, and tell me if you know my reference here, Aaron, please. Bring the War Home, the White Power Movement and Paramilitary America by Kathleen Belew. It's really looking at the rise of the paramilitary right, another iteration of the KKK. And I would be curious to hear, because you mentioned what is known in North Carolina as the Greensboro Massacre. There was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission formed in North Carolina, one of the few in U.S. history, to deal with the aftermath of that, and that was in the early 2000s. What's your take on the rise of the right? You talk about the rise of the Christian right, and then there's the rise of the paramilitary right. That's another element of that. How did you grapple with the rise of the right? What's a key takeaway there as well?
Yeah, I think more work needs to be done. Actually, I'm thinking of my next project after my next project. But I think, I don't really go into analyzing the Klan and the Nazis. In the 70s, they're marginal, but they're laying roots. I mean, and we get into the 80s and you start to get the survivalist movement, and it starts to broaden its base in the militia movement, and down to today where we have the Proud Boys who are kind of, in transition and things of this sort. I think there's much more to be said. I do think I was really struck at this notion of deindustrialization and the whole concept that for an entire swath of the U.S. population, their past is gone. I mean, this used to be their world. It was predicated on God, the church, the family. Everything was a certain way, and it wasn't going to be any different. and that's largely disappearing. And it's getting frayed, in large part, the deindustrialization has a major effect. I watch The Wire, right? And you've got this whole economy, based on the underground economy. But what about Sparrows Point, which was the largest producing steel plant in the country? And it was a whole way of life. I mean, think of the housing situation today. What is the housing crisis all about? Well, they used to build housing for factory workers. Nobody's doing that anymore. We're building housing in the center city for middle-class people who make $100,000 to $200,000. We're not building, housing that a workman or workwoman's paycheck can pay for anymore. That's just one thing. But I think on every impact, a lot of stuff, the media and popular conceptions, everything revolves around ideology. And I think ideology is really important. But I think in this country, especially, people have a lot of trouble with economics and things being grounded on material reality. I mean, it's much nicer to think if I can just get the right idea, I can fix this. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, I start a chapter on the economic dislocations talking about my hometown. Standard, where I grew up, that place is gone. I got out of high school and I went to work at the Dewfold, which was, they had military contracts making double-lined cotton wool undergarments for the military. And that's where I worked, and that's where I made the money to leave town. Or you could have Remington Arms, which they used to make typewriters and they made guns, and that place just closed down. They helped win the Civil War, and then they, were implicated in stuff that's a little bit much more seedy and stuff. In Little Falls, there was Allegro Shoes, and I think something called Roll Fast Bikes. All of these things are gone. And what you have is you have a college, you have nursing homes, you've got state subsidized things, and it's a whole way of life is gone. And Jim Gaffigan talks about, I come from the Rust Belt, which is a nice way of saying it's an area of economic devastation. I mean, it feels like, well, we've already talked about that, so let's talk about something else. But I think one cannot understand what was going on in '79 and that transition to where we've come to today, which is, I mean, there's actually a whole quote of somebody in the '70s say, if things keep going this way, huge areas in the Northeast are going to be devastated. And, take an Amtrak train from Boston to North Carolina and look at all the buildings. They're either empty factories or factories that have been turned into condos. So I think I went on a little tangent, but hey, that's okay, I guess.
You know what? I love Aaron Leonard tangents. Okay, I'm a fan of those tangents. What you're reminding me of also is Chrissie Hynde, of the Pretenders, her autobiography, and I just want to shout it out. Reckless My Life as a Pretender, because what you're describing and because music is so central to your book, and I really appreciate that. I think it's one of the best parts of your analysis, and what you're highlighting is what's happened to rock and roll and then protest music. Confession, Captain and Tennille was the first concert I ever saw. Right. And so I have to laugh because I feel like I have lived your book. I am an audience for your book, and I know so many of us are, and you're doing such a great service to us all for putting it into context and placing these events thematically together to help us understand it. And I know we're out of time, but I hope that everybody reads Meltdown Expected, because we're reconsidering Grenada, a 3-mile island. I can't thank you enough for tackling this subject. and I hope you'll tease us a little bit with what might be next.
Yeah, I've got a contract with Rutgers University Press for a book called Menace of Our Time: The Long War Against the U.S. Communist Party, which basically traverses the space from the first Red Scare of 1919 to the collapse of communism in 1991. And one of the things I found was the whole corpus of counterintelligence files aimed at the Communist Party USA, which was the biggest counterintelligence operation run against the group between 1956 and 1972. So there's a lot of goodies in there. I mean, I shouldn't be so flip. It's pretty awful, but it's also fascinating stuff.
Well, I don't know if I can, it's almost like if you were a radio station, I'm going to ask you to play one of my favorite songs. And if it makes it even into a footnote, I love the history of Eugene Debs and his last run for the presidency from his prison cell in the Atlanta penitentiary, which still stands to this day. And people can go to the Bojangles parking lot there in Atlanta and look at this formidable and ominous penitentiary and see a place of living despair and history. And so I know we're all looking forward to what you do next, because you are helping us understand large history and then the discrete events together as well. And I'm so excited and pleased to be able to be present for your presentation and this book launch. Let me raise the book again as a salute to Aaron J. Leonard. Meltdown Expected: Crisis, Disorder, and Upheaval at the End of the 1970s. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us and for this contribution to our greater understanding.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the good work you and Stephanie and the whole staff are doing there.
We'll come back again, okay?
I sure will.
Thank you so much, audience, for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful evening.